Hello, everybody. This is Rob Nadeau, your e-learning host for today's meeting. I am excited to have you all here. I know there's a few more people that have signed up that are probably working their way into the classroom here. I am very excited to have Dr. Fratkin back with us. He has done a integrative medicine and TCM series with us just last year. And Jake Fratkin has been a doctor of Oriental medicine since 1978. Combining Chinese herbal medicine, Japanese meridian, balance acupuncture, and nutritional medicine. He has authored numerous books, including recently published Essential Chinese Formulas, and is the co-author with Dr. Zhang Shenping of Case Studies in Autoimmune Disease. Jake is a frequent teacher at acupuncture colleges across the US and Europe, teaching both Chinese herbal medicine and Japanese acupuncture, as well as the integration of TCM with functional medicine. He lives and practices in Boulder, Colorado, where he specializes in internal disorders, infections, and pediatrics. Pacific College of Oriental Medicine and the Pacific Center for Lifelong Learning are very proud to introduce you guys to Dr. Jake Paul Fratkin for another great series. Thank you, guys, and I look forward to a great class. Thanks, Jake, for being here.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Is my sound good? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, you sound great.
All right. So welcome to the class. We did a 13-part series for Pacific, which are available as individual classes or as the whole group, on integrating functional medicine topics with TCM. What that talk was really about was taking very modern diseases and talking about it from how modern doctors and naturopaths would look at the problem and in terms of modern physiology and etiology, but then we apply the Chinese herbal medicines to the treatment of those problems. And that was a very successful series, and I think people are going to keep coming back to that because there are a lot of topics that just are not included in general TCM education, things like heavy metal poisoning, leaky gut syndrome, blood sugar problems, diseases that we see in the clinic that weren't necessarily covered from a TCM perspective. And that series was successful, went on 13 classes. And then they asked me, well, let's do some more. What do you want to do now? And I thought about a smaller series of 6 classes where I wanted to accomplish 2 things. One was to talk about very common things that we see in the clinic, but how to treat them with Chinese medicine. And a lot of this stuff is not integrating with functional medicine necessarily, although we will talk about some modern laboratory parameters and so on when they're relevant. But basically, this series was about very common problems where we have Chinese herbal products to deal with it. And people will say, well, I learned that already. But I'm bringing to this 2 things. One is we're going to talk about my personal clinical experience, which is close to 40 years now, treating common disorders with Chinese herbal products. And the second thing was to give an opportunity to start highlighting these American companies that have unique formulas, companies like Golden Flowers, Seven Forest, Health Concerns, Con, Blue Poppy, so on and so on, Herbal Times, that have original formulas that that are not necessarily covered, in your foundation courses. I have this book. This book was a rewrite of my patent medicine book, and it's 225 modern and classical formulas. These are all from China. And a lot of the products I'm going to talk about in this class may or may not be in this book. This book does not detail the Golden Flower and Seven Forest Health Concerns type products. So we're going to try to use this series as an opportunity to talk about some of those products. It's not going to be exhaustive. It's really coming from my personal clinical experience and formulas that I have found useful, that you will find useful. Okay. So today's topic is viral, bacterial, and parasitic infections. This is some place where Chinese medicine just shines. It's just where we do this so much better than Western medicine. And it's important to know what are the formulas that really work. I'm going to talk to you about formulas that I think work, that my clinical experience has shown work. And I've taught this around, and I know that other people are using these products also. So just in terms of the big umbrella, the when infections is a big part of clinical practice, either acute or chronic infections. Now, Western medicine is very limited in this regard. They will use a cyclovir as their main antiviral, which is okay. I'm not 100% going to poo-poo it. They, of course, will use antibiotics for bacterial infections, and they have certain medicines for parasitic infections. The one most commonly used is Flagyl. So it really depends on the parasite and what we mean by parasites. When I talk about parasites that we see most often in clinic, they're protozoans. They're not worms, for example. When someone comes into the clinic and you think it's worms or you confirm that it's worms, personally, I think it's better to go with Western medicine on worms. But for protozoans, basically they're using Flagyl. Sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. Sometimes Flagyl is very effective. A lot of times it doesn't cut it. And then there are some organisms like Blastocystis hominis that don't respond to Flagyl that will respond to the combinations I'm going to suggest today. When we talk about bacterial infections, anybody who knows my work knows that I have steadfastly fought indiscriminate use of antibiotics over the last 25 years of my teaching. I've always been against antibiotics. I've talked about the consequences on the gut biome, on how that really leads to onerous burdens on the body's immune system and creates a lot of background to allow chronic disease to develop. So there's no question in my mind that the overuse of antibiotics has not been good for one's health. There are times when you need it, and we'll talk about those. But most things that are given antibiotics in Western medicine, we can treat with Chinese herbal medicines. And they work really well. They work really well. Now, viruses, this is where we really excel. Chinese medicine has at least 50 herbs that have been proven to have strong antiviral effect. And we can successfully treat a lot of viruses. Things that where the Western docs are just going to end up giving antibiotics. For example, most cough, 95% of cough is viral, not bacterial, but they'll always give antibiotics for it if it comes in. And their excuse to themselves is, well, in case a secondary bacterial infection starts. But it's not good long term because it wipes out your biome in your gut. So this is why we really don't encourage antibiotics. Antibiotics are in the food chain, they're in the medicine chain. It's a cause of a lot of health problems. Once the guts get dysbiosis, you're going to start having lots of problems. You're not going to absorb foods efficiently. You're going to overabsorb things that are not digested. This is the cause of food allergies. You're going to absorb toxins and put a burden on the immune system. So we want to avoid antibiotics as much as possible. Viruses, pretty much docs just say, well, just, wait it out. You'll get better. They really don't know what to do. And if they really looked at the common medicines we have and relatively inexpensive medicines that we have, it could really transform the way one treats infective medicine. So in my practice, I do a lot of acute respiratory, I do a lot of acute GI, and I do a lot of chronic respiratory and a lot of chronic GI. And a lot of these are due to infections. So I'm very big on fighting infections with Chinese medicine. I think that Chinese medicines are particularly effective at fighting these things. All right. So what you should have downloaded. I don't know. Do they have a place here for download of the notes? I don't see that, Robert, that they could download the notes. Did they put that in there? Yeah, I see it down there. Okay. Down below in the very right-hand corner, it says common disorders. There should be handouts where you can download your handouts. I don't see it there, Robert. I hope it's there. So you can, the handout notes on all these classes, I think it's good to print it out before the actual class, staple it, have it, and then you can write any notes that I'm putting on with it. And Robert just explained how to do that. Click on the title and hit download. And if you're going to take these classes, print it out ahead of time, and then it'll be much easier to go along with the flow. What I'm going to have up on the screen here is exactly what you have in your handout notes. So not to worry. It'll be a little bit organized, a little bit different. It's a little bit bigger here. All right, and I will also have at my disposal an arrow. There we go. Yeah, so I have an arrow I can point things out. Okay, this is our index of what we're going to go through. I'm going to give an overview first. We have 4 hours to work on. There'll be a bit of an overlap. I'm going to do a general overview. Then we're going to concentrate on bacterial infections. Then I'm going to concentrate on viral infections. And finally, I'm going to talk about protozoan infections. And by the way, I'm going to try to give a little discussion to Lyme's, because I know Lyme's is a big deal all around the country. And I'm going to give you some ideas on how to work with Lyme's. But the idea of printing down these notes, then you have this index here. You can just jump to the formulas, because what people really want to know is, what do I do when I know what I have? Okay, so that's our index there. In the very back, in the very last page, it says code letters of the herbal companies and index of the herbal categories. When I talk about formulas, those are a bit backwards. On the very last page is the category of 30 herbal categories by code letters. You'll see when we get into it if you're not familiar with the way I work. That allows us to really talk about a herbal formula with more focus. Then there's herbal companies that we've discussed in the literature. They're also by code letter, so you'll see those. We'll explain it when we get into it. Okay. By the way, I always encourage questions, especially about the material. If you have questions, especially about clarifications of something I said, please feel free to type that in. Okay. Okay, so let's just give an overview of the TCM pathology, the physical, not TCM, but the regular pathophysiology of infection. So what an infection is defined as a reaction to an invasion by a disease-causing organism. That's how it's defined. It's a reaction to an invasion by a disease-causing organism. We have 5 basic groups of infectious agents. The first is bacteria, the second is virus, the third is protozoan, the fourth is worms, and the fifth is fungus. These are considered different. Some medicines we use that are anti-protozoans can be antifungal. Worm medicines tend to stand alone. In the history of the world, of society, worm infections have been a big player in malaise and disease. Chinese herbal medicine historically has put a lot of attention into treating worms, but the reality is these are pretty toxic herbs. I tend not to recommend them for the really large worms now. I think it's better to just do a flush with a Western anti-worm medicine. It's very similar to what they give dogs. When dogs have roundworms or tapeworms, they'll give them a Western medicine, and that kills all the worms. And I think that's the first step for worm diseases. In northern temperate climates, we don't see worm diseases very often. You'll see it more in the tropics, where freezes don't happen and people don't have an opportunity to kill the worms by the cold weather. My throat's a little froggy today. So worms, I say default to the Western medicine if possible. Fungus is another problem. Fungus, we talk a lot about in our leaky gut lecture with Candida. You can get it from Candida, which is after antibiotics, or you can get it by living in a fungusy area. For example, if your home has fungus behind the walls. Excuse me a second. people who live like in Georgia in the South, they'll get fungus in the walls, and that's very bad. A fungal disease in the blood and in the lungs is very hard to treat. Western medicine is not very good at it. Chinese medicine actually is limited compared to other therapies. I think if you really have systemic fungus, which is not candida, but these molds, if you have systemic molds, then probably IV drips of hydrogen peroxide or ozone may be a much better way to treat it when it's systemic like that. Those are serious chronic illnesses, those mold infections. Now, candida usually is in the guts and comes after antibiotics, and those are easier to treat, either with Chinese herbs or other Western naturopathic herbs and supplements that you can use, like oregano oil, for example. Oregano oil is very good for fungus. What we're going to concentrate on today is bacteria, virus, and protozoan. Okay, so let's talk about it more. The response. There's an innate immune response, which involves inflammation, and then there's an adaptive response. The innate response is the first step of an infection, is to rush the area with agents that will target the offending organism. And that inflammation is part of that call to the troops to come to the area. So infection can be local or infection can be systemic. Next class, by the way, we're going to talk just about inflammation alone, which is a serious thing that may or may not involve a microbial trigger. Today we're going to concentrate on microbial triggers, but next time we're going to talk about inflammation in general. But there's an inflammatory response, and then there's an adaptive response, which means the body then deals with the debris, cleans up. Now, medically, they're going to hit you with antibiotics, antivirals, which is very few. There's basically acyclovir. Antiprotozoans, very few, basically Flagyl. Antifungals, of which I think Western antifungals are quite good, especially diflucan. I think diflucan is a very good antifungal. I think diflucan is very good. And then antihelminthics means Western medicines for worms. So the demographics. Worldwide, 9 million people died of an infection in 2013. This is 17% of all deaths were due to infection. Now we're talking really the whole world, and this is the third world especially. The worldwide treatments are improving. In 1993, 32% of all deaths around the world were due to an infection. Now it's 26%. So that's really dropped. The top 3 killers have been AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Malaria is still a very serious disease. It's a double whammy if you have malaria and then you get another kind of sickness, such as measles, for example. In Africa, children with malaria who then get measles have a much higher chance of dying than if they just had measles, or vice versa, than if they just had malaria. So most infectious diseases are contagious. They're contagious through the air, people, sending molecules to them, water vapor. It's contagious through blood, through vaginal intercourse. So a lot of agents, are spread person to person. Some are slow, some are fast. Like tuberculosis, you have to be around it a pretty long time to get the exposure. But for people living in crowded conditions where they have no treatment and they're living together for months and months and months, they will spread tuberculosis among themselves. So where do these happen? Common locations. Okay, let's talk about these. And this is not by most common, it's just a list. Urinary tract infections. This is stuff I want to talk about clinically, stuff we see now. Now, urinary tract infections, I haven't targeted here in this class, but you should just know that the Bajang-san is the main medicine we use for that. You know Bajengsan, Bazhengsan, Bajengsan. And incidentally, all these are in this book here, which is my new book, really summing up most of the formulas and who's got them. I'll take a formula like Bajengsan and say availability, who's got it, which manufacturers have it, what are they calling it. Bajengsan is specific for urinary tract infections in the bladder. The Chinese historically have actually will also use it for kidney infections. And I think you can, but once a bacteria migrates from the bladder or urethra up into the kidney, it becomes more serious. And that's one of the stages where I say it's okay to use antibiotics. But when it's in the bladder, Bajengsan will knock it out right away. 1, 2, 3 doses will usually do it. I tell women, try Bajengsan for 24 hours, 48 hours. If it's not better, then consider antibiotics, because 90% of the time a UTI will respond to antibiotics. And UTIs are one of the main reasons antibiotics are given to women. It's very commonly given. You have a UTI, here's your antibiotics. Remember, the goal is to keep down the antibiotics, They hurt you. So if we can get away with not using Western antibiotics, we're better off. Skin conditions, the one that I think of most commonly clinically is impetigo. We'll see it in children. Impetigo can actually, a lot of times, respond to a topical antibiotic cream like you can get in Walgreens in the drugstores. We'll treat it with an internal medicine to treat bacteria, which we're going to discuss. And then you can use topicals, you can use a Walgreens antibacterial, or you can make your own herbal antibacterial topically. But I consider impetigo to be a systemic disease. So you want to get the infection inside also. Again, not necessary to use antibiotics. Now, sometimes in skin problems, we'll combine one of the antibacterial products that I'm going to recommend with a skin type formula. A skin formula like Lian Xiao Jie Dupian or Xiaofengsan. In here is a whole chapter on common products for the skin. So you can combine them if you want to. That works out okay. Respiratory tract. This is a whole discussion in itself. And my last lecture, which will be next September 10th, will just be on respiratory tract infections, throat, ear, lungs. It's such a big part of clinical practice, treating cough, common cold and cough, that I put it at the end because that's when coughs and colds are going to start. No sense starting in spring and summer talking about these things, because the big era for that is between October and March, respiratory. And Chinese medicine just has the best approach to respiratory infections. And my personal clinical practice, I feel like that's a lot of what I do is acute respiratory. So I recommend that you tune in for that class on September 10th. We're not going to talk about respiratory infections today because it's just a huge subject and we really want to focus on that. Tooth infections. Let me just divide infections in between internal and external. An external infection means that it's on the epithelia. It's on the skin. But epithelia is also the inside of the body too. The digestive tract from the nose and the mouth all the way to the anus is the skin. It's epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissues is very exposed to the outside world, and so has a lot of immune agents right there to work on stopping infections. Now, the main thing the body uses in an epithelial infection, its first line of defense, is foreign bacteria, bacteria that we live with, symbiotic bacteria that we have lived with for millions of years, our evolutionary forebears. It's so much so that the DNA of the bacteria has evolved with our own DNA. And we count in the digestive tract, for example, 80% of what we will use for a defense against a foreign microbe is bacteria, foreign bacteria. That's our good bacteria, our probiotics. This is our biome. Our biome is going to attack with enzymes inside the probiotic. Is a bacteria that'll secrete an enzyme that'll destroy bad bacteria. It'll attack viruses. And when we take antibiotics, we wipe that out. We wipe out that first line of defense. And now our body has to come up and deal with what the biome had been doing previously, and that exhausts our immune system. But anyway, when it's an epithelial infection, besides the bacteria, we can attack it very well if we can get to it, if we can touch it. We get our herbs on there, our antiviral and antibacterial herbs, we will destroy those microbes. So what I'm saying here is this is where Chinese herbal medicine works great, when it's in the epithelial. The ears, the eyes, the skin, the nose, the throat, the gums, the lungs, and then vagina, bladder, and so on. All this is epithelial tissue. And if it's epithelial tissue, we can treat it. Now, tooth infections, so one kind of infection is in the epithelial tissue. The other kind is inside. So one part of inside is the blood. Another part of inside is the organs. Okay, so here we may or may not be able to target the infection. For bacterial infections that are in the blood or in the organs, I say, yeah, let's go with the antibiotics. It's too dangerous. If we don't have antibiotics, then yes, we use our own herbs. It's what the Chinese used until recently. Antibiotics only came to being around 1940. Before 1940, we didn't have antibiotics, really. I mean, in common usage. So in the West, they had infections and they died. In the East, they had infections and they survived. Why did they survive? Because we had herbs that could attack those bacteria and viruses. Chinese medicine was never afraid of these infections, septicemia, heart infections, kidney infections. They would treat all of them. But now, because the more serious internal infections are going to be hospitalized, they're going to use antibiotics. That's fine. That's the case where you need antibiotics. You know, a person should need antibiotics maybe 3 times in their life at the most. All these other infections we can treat with what we have. And the only people using Chinese herbs to treat these infections are TCM practitioners. The naturopaths aren't using it. The chiropractors aren't using it. The medical doctors are not using it, which is a real shame because our numbers are quite small. 15,000 of which maybe half are using Chinese herbs, so maybe 7,000 people are using Chinese herbs in this country. It's ridiculous. It's really small. It's so strong. Our herbs are so strong, so effective. All right. So tooth infections, if they're from the inside, may need antibiotics. But most tooth infections, it's a tough one. First of all, once you pull a tooth, it's all epithelial tissue. You don't need to take internal antibiotics. You can work with herbs. You can work with local washes. If the infection is deep in the tooth or deep in the gum, then you may or may not need antibiotics. Dentists are notorious for saying take antibiotics when they clean your teeth. Take antibiotics when, if you have a heart defect and arrhythmia, take antibiotics when they do tooth cleaning. That is it's wrong. It's bad practice. It makes people sick. The only people they proved in research that really need antibiotics on dental procedures might be people that have artificial valves in their heart. If they get an infection, they're at real risk. But if you're at risk of, it's true that infected gums can cause heart infections. And we're not saying don't treat it, but treat it with herbal mouthwashes, treat it with internal herbs to deal with it. When people who had like an arrhythmia would go to the dentist, oh, you have to take antibiotics, I would give them Chinese herbal antibacterials, much safer. much safer. So tooth infections is a common location. A lot of times it's very underdiagnosed. I mean, most of us in our profession, our population is of the demographics where they have good dental hygiene, but historically, a lot of people, not only historically, but demographically, do not have good oral hygiene, and they have a lot of low-level infections in their gums. Now, these bacteria in there will migrate around the body and cause a lot of inflammation. They've definitely done studies where people with low-level bacterial infections in their gums have a higher rate of heart disease, higher rate of problems in the heart from inflammation. Jake, I would venture that those with artificial joints might also need antibiotics for deep dental work since the bacteria can hide out in these joints. Yeah, Jim Lerner, that is a good point. Here's the problem with these new implants. They're becoming very common. Hip replacements especially, but also knee replacements, shoulder replacements. These metal replacements will do very badly in an infection. The problem with teeth work is bacteria can migrate. But I still think that if you do herbal washes, mouth washes to get rid of the post-dental work, and then internal herbs, probably doing okay. I'd be curious how much infections really do show up after dental work. And then the question is deep dental work versus tissue dental work. If you have an implant where they go into the bone, that's deep. And they recommend antibiotics for that in general, and I agree. If you have a tooth implant into bone, you should do antibiotics because if you get an infection in your bone, that's very hard to shake. But if the infection is in the gum, I think we can get it with our medicines. I really do. And I'm not convinced that everybody with a joint implant will need antibiotics when they have dental work. It depends what you mean by deep. If it's going into the bone, then yes. But just around the gums, I think we can get all those. Okay, there's a product called Yin Care. Yin Care is a concentrate. They used it originally for vaginal infections. They have a mouth care product. And I don't mention this in my notes. So you might write this down. Yin Care has a mouthwash, which is very antimicrobial, which you can use to mop up after that or with infections. But most gum infections around the tooth really are epithelial tissue, and we can get to it. Vaginal infections, usually there's a couple different types. Some are fungal, like trichomonas. These are imminently treatable. One study showed that for women who had chronic vaginitis, 80% of them had intestinal candida. So just treating it locally with douches won't be enough. You have to address the intestinal dysbiosis, which is a much more serious and prolonged approach to clean out the intestines from fungus. One of the things I really don't like now, in pregnancy, they'll do a swab of the vagina right before delivery, and if they culture strep, they want the woman on antibiotics. And this is just overkill. First of all, this has been going on for generations, but they only came up with the test recently. And historically, the problems from these vaginal strep infections are very minor. I mean, they're really small in numbers. But they want all women to have antibiotics if they culture this strep bacteria or this staph bacteria. And I'm not saying don't treat it, but we can treat it in other ways. When women show that test, I have them do vaginal douches with antibacterial herbs. And that usually takes care of it. And then have them swab again because it's invasive. When you give antibiotics to the mother at birth, all the bacteria are killed in the vagina. And this is where the child inoculates itself. The child's first inoculation of digestive bacteria happens in the vagina. And so if they don't have that, they are not inoculated from point one. Now the question comes up, what do you do about C-sections where they're also not getting the vaginal implantation? In those cases, the simplest solution is that when the woman breastfeeds, she uses her fingers, takes some vaginal fluid, rubs it around her nipple, let the baby take that. That will introduce the bacteria into the baby in the same way. Just have to do it all the time for a number of weeks to make sure that enough vaginal bacterial implantation happens. This is very important. It's not a joke. You know, a C-section baby is denied that bacteria day one, and then has to create it. It's an issue. It's a real issue. Fortunately, the medical world is coming up to snuff here and is agreeing that the biome is important, and they're at least paying attention to it now. Central nervous system infections are very problematic because it's very hard to get herbs through the blood-brain barrier. If you get an infection, whether it's a protozoan or a bacteria, into the brain, herbs are very slow to get in there. Very slow to get in there, and that becomes an issue. Can we probably, you know, and we do. And in China, when they treat viral meningitis, they are going to give herbal herbs to try to get in there, into the spinal cord, into the brain. Bacterial meningitis, of course, really should be on antibiotics and will be on antibiotics because those people are always hospitalized. Okay, the organs for infections. Liver infections are usually viral, either acute, like acute hepatitis A, or more chronic, like hepatitis B, hepatitis C. In my work, we've done a lot talking about how to treat hepatitis. I have articles on this because it was so big. Hepatitis C was so big in our clinical population. Heart infections, they can be of two types, bacterial or viral. A bacterial infection in the heart should be given antibiotics if you have access to them. If not, then we work with Chinese herbs. The more common are the viral infections of the heart, which Western medicine really has nothing for. And here you get viral myocarditis, you get viral pericarditis. These respond really well to Chinese herbs. Now, in the hospitals in China, they will actually do herbs, even IV drips of Chinese herbs, so that it gets to the heart. But viral pericarditis or myocarditis is very serious on the patient. It's very hard to recover from that, but it definitely can be and should be treated with Chinese herbs. Kidney infections mostly are bacterial. Here's you make the case if it's really symptomatic to go for the antibiotics. If it's low level and chronic, I would work with the Bajang San. Lung infections are mostly viral. Some are bacterial. I've been in clinical practice, I can't even count, 38 years. It's going to be 40 years 40 years in 2 years. I've been in clinical practice 38 years. I've only seen 2 cases of bacterial pneumonia. They are very, very rare. People with bacterial pneumonia, they're very sick, high fevers. They're spitting up a mixture. It looks like a brownish yogurt. It's very pussy. They're coughing up a lot of pus. It's not your normal phlegm. It's really pus that they're coughing up. They're very sick, high fevers. And those people usually are and should be hospitalized. But real bacterial pneumonia is extremely rare. And when they say you have pneumonia, everybody assumes it's bacterial. Plus, the doctors will give you antibiotics just in case. But most pneumonia is viral, and we can treat that. Believe me. And we're going to talk about that in the respiratory class. It's very important that really Western medicine doesn't have good medicines for cough. It really doesn't. And we do. All right. Any questions about these locations of the most common infections? I might be missing a few. What I did miss here is the blood infections. Lyme's is a blood infection. We're going to talk about that. Systemic viruses like West Nile and dengue fever, and even the more serious exotic tropical diseases like Ebola and now Zika is coming into fray. These are viral diseases which we can and should treat. I don't know how successful. I mean, I'm not going to say I've treated Ebola because I have not. But I know that should Ebola raise itself in southern China, they'll hit it with Chinese herbs. The doctors there are very experienced. Any questions about this grouping? Okay. Uh, Overview of TCM, the TCM approach for infections. We really had a couple different kinds of organization. First, it was the Shanhan Lung, of course. The Shanhan Lung was the second century. They being the system of Shanhan Lung, promoted the six divisions. First were the three levels of exogenous invasions, so the Taiyang, Shaiyang, and Yangming. And the second was the three levels of internal progression through the Taiyin, Shaoyin, and Jueyin. A lot of this is covered in your basic TCM approach. Zhang Zhongjing, when he was 18 years old, went off to visit family for an extended period. And he came back to his village, and 80% of the people were dead of some quick-acting infectious disease. No one knows what it was. Cholera, typhoid, we don't know. He came back, and he was married. He had children. His parents were dead. Everybody was gone, and he had no place to stay. He started to become a wandering itinerant herbalist. He determined to try to figure out what had happened. So anecdotal, so impressive on his life. He was determined to find out what happened and how to treat it. And so he spent a good part of his life going around and studying with different herbal masters and writing down prescriptions. So in his Shanhan Long and later the Jingui, we don't know, are these his discoveries or were they his teachers that he wrote down? Of course, Zhang's big contribution was his commentaries on the approach. And he wrote down his commentaries and these formulas, and he died unpublished, unrecognized, a pauper. But his papers were saved and they made their way to the Imperial Medical School that was just organizing in the Han Dynasty, and they separated. Wang Bi is thought to have separated the formulas into six division formulas. This became the Shanhan Long. And then the other was the Jingui Yaluo, which was everything else, dermatology, pediatrics, gynecology, and so on. So the Shanhan Long really talked about the progression, and that model stayed for a while. Now, Shanhan Long went in and out of favor throughout the history of Chinese medicine. But basically, it was called Treatise on Cold-Induced Disorders. And there are still people that practice Shanhan Lung very authentically, and I admire them for their authenticity. And, but Chinese medicine has just evolved, continuously evolved. And the doctors write everything down. And what we have today is so much better than Shanhan Lung for treating infectious diseases. I think anybody who treats infectious diseases purely on Shanhan Lung without adjustment is harming the patient, because Chinese medicine has evolved so much since then. The second movement was the Wenbing movement, which happened in the 1700s. Two big names were associated with this. Ye Tianshi, 1667 to 1746, and Wu Tong, 1758 to 1836. They advanced the theories. They talked about the progression of pathogenic heat toxins. They were the ones who said, look, infectious diseases are caused by heat toxins, exogenous things that can be treated and killed. And what they called heat toxins, we now know to be either bacteria or viruses. And so there was two organizations. One was the four levels of pathogenic progression, starting in the Wei Qi, which is the surface, then the Qi, just below the surface, then the Ying, which is into the meridians, and finally the blood. And depending on where the infection was, treatments would be offered. Ye Tianshi and Wu Tang have several books on the Wenbing. The other level was the three levels of pathogenic localization. They would talk about the infections in the upper burner, infections in the middle burner, and infections in the lower burner. And they started talking about formulas, but especially herbs, application of herbs that address heat toxins. Modern research confirms the effectiveness of single Chinese herbs for treating microbial infections. I have some, we'll talk about some herbs. I'm not going to go to them in detail, but all that material comes from this book, Chinese Medical Herbology and Pharmacology by John Chen and Tina Chen. I think everybody here knows the Chens. They are a brother and sister team. It's not a husband and wife team. And John is a OMD, Doctor of Oriental Medicine, who's also a pharmacologist, PhD level. And he's known as being the guy talking about interactions of Western medicines with Chinese herbs. He's the go-to expert on that. But more importantly is his work on materia medica and prescriptions. His books rival those of Bensky and Bensky's group, Bensky, Barrellet, Gamble. They're all very good books, and Andrew Ellis. But they're very, because John is a native Chinese reader, he really goes into the literature from China. And his materia medica is really excellent, or their materia medica is excellent, and their formula book is excellent. They cite a lot of research whenever they can. They'll cite whatever they found. It's not, may not hold up to the most thorough, but it's really instructive. All right, so in terms of Chinese herbal categories, there are certain categories that we can assign to different microbes. So these categories, they're kind of a recent invention. When Chinese medicine became institutionalized in the 1950s and organized, that's when these categories came out. On the last page, I have the 30 categories of these 30 categories in English and Chinese. So the one category, which I label as DB, clear, heat, drain, dampness, Qing, Lisher, these are all these herbs have been found to have antibacterial and anti-protozoan effect. Clear, heat, drain, dampness. They include all the Huang herbs, which have berberines in them. Then we have clear, heat, resolve toxins, Qing, Juedu. This is category DD. All these herbs have antiviral effect. Before the institutionalized Chinese medicine in 1950s, we had about 5-7 herbs commonly used for viruses. But since 1950, so many herbs have been discovered and talked about that now Bensky has 35 herbs in this category, and John Chen and Tina Chen have 50 herbs in this category. So the area of antiviral herbs has really been developed. So you'll see in these antiviral formulas a lot of those herbs from DD. Finally, there we have a category called kill worms, Sha Chong. This is category Q, and these have not only anti-helminthic effect, but also anti-protozoan effect. All right. So what I want to say about the discovery of these new antiviral herbs. A lot of people who come out of the very classical training, Shan Hanlong training, and so on, they'll look at my work and they'll say, oh, you're very Western oriented. You're just killing viruses, you're just killing bacteria, instead of really understanding how the body's affected. And I may give lip service to that because modern China gives lip service to that. If you look into what's happening in China today, they're very interested in viruses and bacteria as causative agents, not just of infectious diseases, but also of cancer. They feel there's a viral trigger in a lot of the cancers. So it's not just me. And also, I would never say, treat this person with Huanglian, Coptis, or treat this person with Isatis Dachia. It's always in a mixture, and it's always taking into account the status of the body of the patient. Are they strong? Are they weak? What signs and symptoms are they showing? I still very much adhere to the practice of TCM. So we're working 8 categories. We're working, where's the pathogen? Who is this body, who has this pathogen? Are they yin deficient, yang deficient, or whatever? So since 1950, during the first 10 years of the Communist Revolution, they did a lot of health work. They asked very remote places in China, what do you have that might benefit other people in this country? What herbs do you know about that we don't know about? What formulas are you using that we don't know about? And they started cross-pollinating everybody with information, literature, printed material, which the Chinese government was very willing to share. And that emerged herbs that were unheard of in classical times. Andrographis Chuan-Xinlian. A lot of herbs came up that we never knew about. Baijang Sao, Petrinia. Now suddenly we have these great herbs that since 1950. So a lot of the antimicrobial response. It's not me being out of it. This is what's happening in China. I learned that day one when I went to China 25 years ago. The reliance on herbs with antimicrobial effect. So what we do on these series, and I'm doing a lot of them now with Pacific, we have 4-hour classes. At the end of 50 minutes, we take a 10-minute break.